Taps has such a very interesting origin to it. There's always been some sort of lights out signal in the military, usually something that was beaten on drums. And as we have to remember, the call for the lights out, to go to sleep, to turn off their lights, usually followed the last roll call of the day, which was called tattoo.
Mm-hmm.
And in the military, back then, of course, the military loved to take roll calls, and there would be three official roll calls of the day. The first one would happen at Reveille. If you've ever been to a Civil War event, you hear Reveille being sounded on the bugle, and then you hear this long concert by the fifes and drums
Mm-hmm.
as they play what's called the three camps. That's to give the soldiers enough time to fall in on the company streets and the roll be taken. The second roll call of the day was taken at the end of the duty day, which was called retreat. And retreat doesn't mean to run away from the face of the enemy. It means the ending of the duty day and another roll call. Then the final roll call of the day was the tattoo. And the tattoo, which dates back as to the 12th century, was usually uh, run by the provost or the sergeant major of a garrison, who would take a drummer and they go through the town beating the tattoo. And this was not only a signal for the soldiers to return back to the garrison for the final roll call, but also a signal for the barkeeps to stop serving liquor.
There you go.
So that's where this didn't dough didn't tap toe, the Dutch comes from. And of course, I'm probably going to get a lot of people, arguing, no, that's not what that means. And yeah, I understand, and I'm trying to figure that out myself. After the last roll call, there would be a signal for lights out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the infantry manuals of the time, the call for lights out was one that was taken from the French tactics. Now, as I mentioned before, we borrowed everything from the French, which is we have a very interesting history of borrowing things throughout our military history.
Mm-hmm.
During the American Revolution, we really didn't have any kind of set calls in our books. So by the end of the Revolution, we were using calls and signals based from the English. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then that switched to the French after 1812. We got a little tiff with the English again. So we decided to use French based signals. So if you would look at a military tactics book from 1860 and turn to the bugle calls, then open a French manual tactics of the same period, you will notice they are the same exact bugle calls. So the call for extinguished lights was a call that Napoleon liked. It sounds like this. Now, that call, it turns out, was Napoleon's favorite bugle call. And Napoleon even had a school of music and a training school for buglers. Well, and just for anyone who says, I recognize that call, well, it's the first part of today's tattoo that we use in the military. So the old extinguished lights, the French call, is the first part of our new tattoo. And by the way, this is where it gets all confusing. So anyway, it usually was followed by the beating of a drum 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. That was the drum signal also for lights out. And soldiers started calling that, of course, drum taps. And if you read diaries of soldiers, there's one like at VMI who got demerits in 1840 for being out after taps. And they're not referring to the bugle call that we know today. They're referring to the drum beat. So now enter Daniel Adams Butterfield, who was from Utica, New York, the son of John Butterfield, a very prominent businessman who started an overland express service that was to later become American Express. Daniel went off to Union College and then went off to see the world and then came back to New York, where he enlisted in the 12th New York Militia and rose to the rank of colonel. Through his political connections, he becomes a general officer. And his big claim to fame at the beginning of the Civil War is that he is the first general officer across the bridge from Washington into Virginia when the Civil War starts. He has a brigade. It's the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, 5th Army Corps that he's in charge of. And they are involved with several battles. He's also a bit of a musician, too. He's a bugler. And in fact, Oliver Wilcox Norton, who's in the 83rd Pennsylvania, I mentioned him before. By the way, the 83rd is part of that brigade. So that's the connection.
Gotcha.
Okay.
He even writes about Butterfield like picking up the bugle and sounding the charge at battles. So he knew that that he was a good bugler. Anyway, fast forward to 1862, the summer. The 5th Corps is on the shores of the James River south of Richmond after the 7 days battle, where they almost took Richmond, but not quite. And they're there for the entire month, for July into August of 1862. 100,000 men camped along the river near Berkeley Plantation, also Harrison's Landing, named after a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a future president of the United States. So every night, of course, the regulation call is heard, and Butterfield doesn't like it. And he decides he's going to change it. So he gets the brigade bugler, who is Oliver Wilcox Norton. Even though he's with the 83rd, he's risen up to the rank of brigade bugler, which is kind of a nice deal for him because you get to ride a horse. Whatever happens in that tent, and you hear so many variations. Butterfield whistled the tune to him, wrote it down on a piece of paper, but he talks about it, how they changed some notes here, lengthening some, shortening others here and there. But whatever, he goes out that evening and sounds the call for the first time. There's 24 notes that we're familiar with. The next day, buglers from other regiments, brigades, find him and say, "What was that?" And he says, "It's the new call that the general asked me to play." And everybody asks for a copy of the music, and pretty soon everyone's playing it. But no one seems to know where the call came from. Did Butterfield make it up from his mind, or was it something? Well, it turns out that the call exists in an early manual, in the United States manual, in a trumpet call. Called, interestingly enough, tattoo. And it's an early tattoo that goes out of use prior to the Civil War. And if you look at the last 6.5 measures of this old tattoo, you'll find the notes of taps. And if you look at it and compare it with the modern taps, you'll see what Nort was talking about, like lengthening some notes and slowing some notes down here. So that's how taps came into being. It taps has no meaning. It's not an acronym for anything. It's not some strange language for tattoo. It's not a derivation of dodin tapto. What it is that the word evolves from those 3 drum beats I'd mentioned before, because the soldiers were naturally called drum taps. In fact, I think there's a book called Drum Taps about a Civil War experience, a soldier's experience. So when the bugle call takes over playing for the 3 drum taps, soldiers naturally start calling it taps.
There you go.
So that's how it becomes. Long answer to this.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, it's important to know for sure.
Yeah, and we know it primarily as it relates to its function in a funeral setting. And
Right.
I remember that History Channel video you mentioned that came about out of necessity for a funeral for a cannon, an artillery soldier, and they didn't want to give their position away by doing the cannon volleys. Is that pretty much established as how that happened?
Yes. John Thibault was the captain with I think it was the 3rd United States Artillery. And he had ordered, when it was the death of a cannoneer, that instead of the 3 rifle volleys, and by the way, rifle volleys have always been used to signal as a customary signal at a funeral. And that signal itself predates back into antiquity, where people would shout the name of the person or deceased 3 times above the grave. This is that magical 3 number. So every time when I hear, a gun salute being referred to as a 24 gun salute, I sort of bite my lip.
Yeah,
What they really mean is the 3 volley salute. So anyway, John Thibault decided to forego the 3 volley salute and just ordered the bugler to sound taps instead. Now, what's important to realize is that taps is the only bugle call that has a dual purpose in our military. It was originally set as a call to go to sleep, lights out. And it still remains that way at every United States military base throughout the world at either 9:30, 10 o'clock, or 10:30, depending on the commander of the base. Taps is sounded. That is the last call of the day. But it also has a dual purpose as being the final musical honor at a military funeral. And I just also have talked about this in an article I wrote called Taps in the day of COVID-19, because we're seeing more and more buglers who are going out every evening at 7 o'clock on their front porch and sounding taps. Taps over the years has become transcended the military. People remember being at summer camp. If you were at Interlochen as a musician, you probably heard taps being sounded every evening. They had buglers who were part of that program. Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, picked up the call. It would be sounded at the end of fraternal organization meetings. So it's become more than a military call. But, bottom line, it is an honor that is reserved for our military personnel, those who've served honorably in uniform. Right. The call itself, after the Civil War, after John Thibault asks his bugler to sound taps, the call is used more and more at funerals services. That by the end of the Civil War, it's done unofficially. As the years went on after the Civil War, there were more and more memorial services. People were erecting statues all over the country. There'd be wreath layings at cemeteries. In 1868, we have our first official Memorial Day commemoration, which was called Decoration Day back then, at Arlington National Cemetery. I've been trying to find out if taps was sounded at that ceremony, and looking through all the records with that ceremony, I can't find. But we do know that later on it was. So now, if you look in the Army books, the Army manuals of 1870 and 1880, they have the call for extinguished lights. They finally get away from that French piece, and they insert the music to taps. But they don't call it taps. And the only reference to it is for lights out. So so unofficially it's played at funerals. Finally, in 1891, this is how long it takes the Army to do it. In 1891, in the manual, the Army manual, it finally changes the title to taps, with the explanation that the call is to be sounded after the firing of the 3 volleys. So that's the first official recognition of it. Even though it does appear in some private manuals ahead of time, the military doesn't officially recognize it until 1891. And then from there, it just has become our national song of remembrance. In fact, it took another, oh my goodness, 100 and some years before we got Congress to recognize it as our national song of remembrance. Through the efforts of a few people, for the 150th anniversary of TAPS, we lobbied Congress to ask them to have it codified as a national song of remembrance, which they finally did in 2014.
Oh wow!
So the only sad part about that is that they didn't put in the protocols for it, which I had really hoped they would, like what to do, because people still ask, when I hear taps, what do I do? Yeah. Do I stand up? Do I salute? Do I face the music? What do I do?
What's the answer to that?
the answer is quite easy. You treat it the same way as you would the national anthem. So if you're in uniform, you would salute. If you're not, you can put your hand over your heart. If you hear it from a distance, you will turn and face toward the music. And that's at military funerals or memorial services. In the evening, when it's sounded as a call to go to sleep, there is no real protocol required. Unless you're really gung-ho and want to salute. That's okay. And I will tell you that at Arlington, it's taken quite seriously. If I was with the honor guard waiting for our funeral to arrive, and we'd be standing around in a group talking and stuff, and then we'd hear 3 volleys go off in taps, everything would cease. Every member would turn towards the music and go to a salute. So that it's important, that honor is made.